Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our third Facebook Friday. Tonight, we're really excited to have Julia Spencer-Fleming here with us to discuss her new book, Hid from Our Eyes. She was supposed to be at the store a couple of weeks ago for the new release, so we're really excited that we were able to do it this way. How are you tonight, Julia?
I'm well, staying at home. I've been at home for, oh gosh, well over a month now.
Yeah.
And I've got two daughters and a friend of my youngest's who is another university student who couldn't get back to his place. So, it's a full house.
Well, at least you have company.
Yeah. How about you?
I'm good. We've been pretty much either locked in the bookstore processing remote orders or locked here at the house. My husband, Matt, was going a little stir crazy, so he went and sat in the corner of the store today just to have kind of a different place to stare at all day long. So to get us started off real easy, can you tell us a little bit about the new book?
Yes. So the new book is something I've been working on and off and on and off and on and off for the better part of 6 years. Not because it takes me that long to hammer a book into shape, but I had a lot of life getting in the way of it. But the concept that really intrigued me from the very start of the book was the idea of showing 3 different investigations in 3 different time periods with 3 different police chiefs from the same small town, Miller's Kill, that I write about, and to have their stories intertwined. So in the first murder, which takes place in 1952, there's Police Chief Harry McNeil and a very young state trooper who gets involved named Jack Little. In 1972, Jack Little is now a 40-something chief of police, and the suspect in the murder is a 20-year-old, very young Russ Van Alstyne, who is just back from the Vietnam War, and he's very damaged and very angry. And then we leap forward to present day. It's not quite actually our present day, but it is certainly, their present day. And Russ Van Alstyne, the angry young man, is the police chief. And we get to see Jack Little come back again. Now he's in his late 70s and is a retiree. And I really loved the idea of telling a story about the relationships that men have, in particular, I think, with mentors and teachers, the men that teach boys how to become men for good or for ill. It's something I really noticed. I never saw a boy growing up. My brother's 9 years younger than I am, and I was off to college before he was. But then I grew my own boy and got to see him and his friends. And I realized girls sort of fall into womanhood, but I see so often that boys need to learn how to be men, and they need that from a father or an uncle or, the guy at their first job. And so that really intrigued me. And that's really what the book is about. But I have to have murders in there because I write mysteries. So there are murders.
One of the things I really liked about this one is that it was so much kind of Russ's story and not Claire's. Like, Claire's there, but she's definitely, I don't want to say she's a background character, but she's definitely not kind of the focus of this book like she has been in the previous ones. And I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of not only keep the series fresh, but kind of also tell some of Claire's story, because so much of her life is wrapped up in Russ and his job as well.
Yeah. Well, I think at this point in particular, I'm bringing forward different characters to the foreground, to a little bit more to the background, and different characters and different stories have had their particular journey to make. So One Was a Soldier, for instance, is a book about Claire, who's in the National Guard, coming back after a twice extended tour, in the war. And it's her story. Russ is very much there, and he's an important part of it. But the journey and the emotional change and development that needs to happen is Claire's change and development. And in this, it's Russ was the one who needs to sort of go through this change and development.
My cat peeking around the corner of the screen.
That's okay. My cat's going to show up sooner or later when she realizes I'm sitting down.
It's really interesting that you talk about, the way the characters kind of move in and out of the stories, because I hadn't thought about this until you said that. The books say that it's kind of a Russ and Claire mystery, but as you've evolved over the course of the series, they really have kind of become this big ensemble cast where it's not necessarily just kind of their series. It really is kind of all about Miller's Kill.
Yeah, in some ways, I really wish that we had gone with Miller's Kill Mysteries as a tag, because I feel that, especially at this point, it's more accurate. The town was always, from when I first conceived of these stories, the town was always like the third major character. And I find now that I've got, as you say, I've got a deep bench, of characters, and some of them move forward and have really big parts in any given story. And I think that's one of the great pleasures of writing a series. You get, I think of my friend, and I know you've had her, I'm sure, many times at the store, Deborah Crombie, who she's in, I think, 18 or 19 books in to her fabulous series. And there's just this she could have a book that did not have her two main sleuths, Duncan and Gemma, in it at all. And you'd still read it because she has such a great grasp of all these other people whose lives are intertwined with theirs.
I think it's kind of like you said, it's a great way to keep the series fresh. Like you had one book, and I think you do such a good job of this, like, because there was, one book where like all of the action takes place over like 24 hours. So I think that it's a really interesting way to be able to tell a story kind of in a small town like that, and kind of avoid kind of what they call the Cabot Cove syndrome of.
You really have to be careful when you're writing about a small town mystery to avoid it becoming, the death of the week. And it's always the guest star, who's the murderer. I have discovered, so this is my 9th book. I'm working on the 10th. And I've discovered by this point that a lot of my books sort of come in pairs. I'll write one and then I'll write a reaction to it. So for instance, the 24-hour book, which is
Darkness and Death, maybe?
Darkness and Death, yes, thank you. I don't know what, it's one of them. If only I'd gotten to the ABCs first, But that book was in part, in my part, as a writer and wanting to do something different, a reaction to the fact the book before that, Out of the Deep I Cry, has a story that goes over 70 years. So, and then I wrote All Mortal Flesh, which is the 5th book. And it's a dark book. It ends in a really sort of grim, sad, frozen out place. And the book after that, I Shall Not Want, is, I wouldn't exactly call it a comedic romp because that's not what I do, but it's different in every way. It's hot, it's set in the middle of summer instead of in the dead of winter, and it's got humorous elements in it, and it does have comedic elements. It's got romance. It's a much lighter sort of book as a contrast to that. So back and forth, this book is very much about a looking over people throughout their lives and seeing these characters at different stages. And the 10th book that I'm working at is very immediate. It's very in the moment. And it's actually, I think the motif is a little bit more of a journey on the one that I'm working at, where various people are going to have to come together to find a character who is missing at the end of Hid From Our Eyes and figure out what has happened to this character.
So do you plot books ahead? Like, did you know when you were doing Hid From Our Eyes, did you have any idea how that was going to inform the next one? Or is it sort of just a surprise when you sit down to write the new one?
It's by the time I'm halfway through a book, the next one is germinating in my head. So when I was, when I was halfway through, God, what was the one before this? Through the Evil Days. Through the Evil Days, which is very much about very, very tight. You know, there are only like 4 characters basically in the whole thing. And I knew I was looking for something that was open. I wanted it to be a Russ book. And ideas started occurring to me about going back to some of these characters because we've met these characters from the past before. Both of the police chiefs show up in Out of the Deep I Cry, briefly, but you know, they're there. And so sort of going back and digging into that. And I was about, I don't know, halfway, 3/4 through Hid from Our Eyes, and I started thinking, all right, what do I want to do? I really wanted to sort of literally take it out of Miller's Kill in a little way. And then that enables me to put in the seeds. Sorry, I just heard this NPR show on gardening before I joined you, so all my metaphors are going to be about gardening, but it enables me to scatter the seeds in the current book that are then going to blossom in the next book, taking that metaphor all the way to the ground.
One of the things I also really love is you deal with a lot of kind of social issues in the books, but not in a way that feels like kind of you're writing a social issue book. Like you've dealt with Claire's addiction, you've dealt with kind of gay bashing and homophobia. And, you know, in this one, you deal with kind of a little bit of community policing with the vote about the police department. And you do it in such a kind of organic way, like environmental issues in one of the books too. Is that something that you're aware of, like when you start, that you know that's going to be a part of it as well? Or is that just, does that?
Oh yeah, very much so. You know, one of the things that I've always said is that because it takes me a long time to write a book, not usually 6 years, but you know, 2 years is not unusual for me. It needs to have things that I'm really interested in. It needs to interest me, you know, from the terms of being able to do new things with the character, with different things with structure. I like constructing books differently. And it needs to have issues that I am interested in, that I want to learn more about, and that I feel passionate about. And some books much more so than others. To Darkness and to Death was very much about homophobia and gay bashing and the different things that communities can and can't do to help overcome that. You know, this Hid from Our Eyes, a little bit less so, that I was very interested in the community policing aspect, because that's something that is happening in small towns or not so small towns around the country, where people are deciding, do we get rid of our small force and, you know, pay in to the state troopers and have them take over. And of course, the ongoing story of Claire's struggle with addiction is something that came out of the research that I did for One Was a Soldier, when she, you know, comes back, because I discovered that, in fact, and we all know this, that there are a number of people who come back from war struggling with addiction.
Yeah, and it, like I said, it always feels kind of very organic. It doesn't feel like it's kind of a like ripped from the headline situation where you're like, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write this book. The way you weave it into the story is just, it's really fantastic.
Thank you. I mean, I don't want to read a book that's a thinly veiled, you know, bromide. I mean, I love reading Robert Heinlein, but let's face it, sometimes it's like reading, you know, the newsletter of the Libertarian Manifesto or something. And everything that happens around a social issue should come out of the characters involved, which is why you'll hear a lot of different points of view in my books about any particular social issue, because real human beings have a lot of different points of view. And hopefully it doesn't look like I'm putting my thumb too hard, see my thumb there, down on the scale.
So you mentioned kind of Robert Heinlein. When you are working on a book, are you able to kind of read as well, or are you one of the, like, you're going to work on it and then when it's done, then kind of reading as your reward for getting a book done?
When I'm really, really face down in a book, I tend to read a lot of nonfiction. And then when I'm not, you know, working huge chunks of the day, I read, you know, it's hard not to read fiction. I adore reading, but it does tend to be outside of my own genre. You know, I do read a lot of science fiction. I like women's fiction. I like pretty much anything except maybe like techno fiction. So it's, if you've got a 5-page description of some sort of a, ballistic launcher, probably not going to be my book, but everything else is. I find that I need to stay away a little bit from mystery because one of two things will happen. Either I will read something, and I remember this really distinctly reading one of Steve Hamilton's Alex McKnight books. I think it was like The Sky is Red, or Red, and there's red in the title. There's a bookseller line for you. Can you find it for me? And I read it, and while I was working, I thought, oh my God, this is brilliant. My book is never going to be this good. I'm not this good with words. And it just depressed the hell out of me. And I thought, why am I doing this? Or I read something that's very clever, because there's a lot of twists and tricks that we do in mystery. And then a week later, I'm writing this really clever twist, and then it strikes me when I go back to edit it that I've just ripped off somebody, often somebody that I know, because I feel like I know everybody in mystery now. So yeah, when I'm not deeply into working on a book, like right now, I'm doing tons of promotion because my book is just out. I'm not writing. I'm binge reading mysteries and thrillers.
Do you find when you read them, are you kind of also picking them apart as a writer, seeing, because like when I interviewed James Rollins last week, he said like when he was getting started, like he read Jurassic Park and was like, okay, when does the first kill happen? When does the dinosaur show up for the first time? Do you do that, or is it hard to turn off that?
Yeah. I think I read on 2 tracks, and I suspect a lot of professional authors do. On one hand, if it's a really compelling book, I'm zipping along with it and really enjoying it. But there's also a second track that is analyzing, oh, here's the beat, here's what the authors did. When I, over the Christmas holiday, I got a copy of Stephen King's The Institute as a gift, and just loved it. I mean, talk about somebody who is a page turner, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm turning the page as fast as I can, reading along, but at the same time, I'm thinking, oh, this is a 4-act structure, and look at how he like those. If you see it, you can see those wonderful beats are just boom, 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 and thinking he is such a professional, which obviously he is. It doesn't detract, actually, I think, from enjoyment. It's like listening to a piece of music if you were really, really well versed in, I guess, composing or playing. You can, I think, in some ways better appreciate the artistry that the writer is bringing. Of course, it also means if they're not very artistic, it's like honking on your ear.
You also said you read kind of a lot of nonfiction when you're working on stuff. So what is your research process for the books? Do you have to do much research into things when you're kind of creating the world of Miller's Kill?
I tend to stick mostly with contemporary. So my research for a lot of those starts out with maybe a few days once I've nailed down the concept and I need to dig in. For instance, I had to do research about brewing meth, as who hasn't, done research on brewing meth, and distribution lines and how do the gang system work with that. So that's, that doesn't really take a whole lot. And then for something contemporary, I tend to work forward and I keep a document going among several that I call just questions. And when I run into something that I know I'm going to need to look up or really fix or something, I'll put it in brackets and I'll make a note for myself. Look at this. What is the real answer? I'll fill in, either I'll leave it blank or I'll make a fake answer or something. And then I go back to it. With Hid From Our Eyes, I wound up having to do a lot more research because it's set in the 50s and the 70s, which, it's practically contemporary, right? But there's a lot of stuff that's different in those time periods, the way people spoke and the way they thought and these sort of, products and things that were around. I am in such awe of people who write historical fiction. I love historical fiction. I love historical mysteries and straight historical fiction. You know, I adore it. And how people do that is so difficult because I would spend all of my time researching, and I'd put out a book, you know, once every 6 years, which would not be great.
So one of the things also that's really great about the series is she's such a dynamic character. And how do you balance kind of writing a minister and trying to make them, I don't want to say still feel like a person, but not kind of be the stereotype of what people expect ministers to be like? She's very human. She still has flaws, which I don't know that people would necessarily expect to pick up when they realize that she's the main character. So how do you find that balance there?
Yeah, I've over the years, I have gotten aggrieved emails from people who wrote me and saying, I thought you were a Christian writer. It's like, well, I am a Christian and I am a writer. I'm just an Episcopalian, and we're sort of a different breed of that. So I start with the premise that Claire is a person who has a really difficult job, and she's alone at it a lot, and she does not have all the support that she needs. And she is driven by this sort of almost pathological desire to help people and to make things better for them. And then it runs from there. But, you know, she's human in every other respect. It was so important to me when I started out, because there are so many pieces of fiction or movies where the clergy person is one of two things, right? You know, either they are Elmer Gantry, and, you know, they're a fraud, and by the end of the book, the minister is like stolen a car and heading out of town with the choir master's wife and a bag of cash in the back, and he runs over a puppy dog on the way out too, you know, because so there's that. And then the other way that it's presenting, can you hear that back there? Guys, I'm live on Facebook. Can you call it down? Sorry, we forgot. Full house, like I said. So the other sort of minister is the touched by an angel one, where they're just like so pure and so good. You know, they probably never fart because they're just not earthly enough to do that. And I just wanted to write about somebody who, the ministers that I know, the priests and ministers and clergy people, are intensely human people who are just have taken on this job that, especially in our secular society, doesn't get a whole lot of thanks. You know, it's not the high status job that it was back in 1950.
Yeah, and I think, like I said, you do a really good job of kind of, she ends up somewhere in the middle of those, and that's one of the reasons why she's so great, because she is so human. Mm-hmm. So before we take off for the evening, does anybody who is watching have any questions? If you do, I'm watching the comment box, so let's see if we have any questions from the crowd. Nothing's popping up.
It's just because I explain everything so comprehensively and eloquently.
So one of the things that we've talked about when we've been doing this with others, you told me a little bit already that kind of you have a full house. You know, so much of, from what people tell us, being author is kind of sitting alone in your home and you're working, you know, kind of by yourself. And you know, maybe you don't put on pants some days because you're working. And now we're kind of in that, where that's sort of everyday life. Yeah. So does it feel different to you, or is it just like, oh, this is kind of what life is like?
You know, honestly, and I feel like for all of my author friends, I mean, if you were a full-time writer, it's like we were doing stay at home before stay at home was cool. It was like before it was a hashtag, this was our life. So not a whole lot. You know, I do miss being able to, I really miss being able to go to the town dump on Saturdays and see people and get rid of my recyclables. They have this great little thing called the share shop. So, you know, people give away their stuff. And that was a big social highlight of the week. And, you know, I miss being able to go to church in person of a Sunday. but it's not that much different from the way that my life is, especially I live out in the country. So, I still, thank heavens, that's the dog going out for a walk, get to go out and walk the dog. I've got a big yard. We're going to start doing yard work and gardening and things. So that's not that different. What I'm finding interesting is, and I've been talking about this a lot with other writers, is what is this going to be doing to literature, to fiction going forward? I'm in the early stages of my next book, and I'm not going to put it in that book, but the next one, do you acknowledge it? Do you just have people saying, oh, remember back when we were in quarantine and we had to stay at home and it took 18 months before we got a vaccine, and then you go on? Do you dig into it? How long is it going to be before we can start really writing about it? There's so many plots that present itself. People are walking around masked and with gloves. Tell me there's not a mystery writer that doesn't see some juicy possibilities. But then do you want to make it look like you're playing with something that is literally life and death? It's interesting, and it's going to be a real judgment call going forward, I think.
Maybe we'll see a resurgence in kind of the locked room mysteries now, since everybody's, maybe that'll be where it goes.
That would be awesome.
Wouldn't it? Yeah. So we did have one question from Laura. She wants to know how you come up with the titles for the books.
So because one of my main characters is an Episcopal priest, all of the titles come from hymns. Some of them are the first line of a hymn. My first one, In the Bleak Midwinter, is actually a poem by Christina Rossetti that was, set as a hymn. This has led to two problems. I thought it was very clever when I came up with the idea because, as we all know, in series, mystery writers like to have thematic titles, so you can tell it's all part of the same thing. There's colors and alphabet and nursery rhymes and such. So I thought it was very clever. But I realized there are two downsides now that my readers are stuck with. One is they have really long titles that can be hard to remember. So Hid from Our Eyes is one of the shorter titles. The working title for the book that I'm working on now is At Midnight Comes the Cry. What do you think? You like it?
Great, yeah.
I'm asking booksellers, because booksellers are the ones who know. So it's a good title, but it's long. And the other is there is no way in heck to tell just by looking which is the first book and which comes later. They should just have giant numbers on the covers.
And it looks like Keith wants to know which one was your favorite book to write.
Oh, wow. The favorite to write. That is interesting. I don't think I've ever been asked that. People ask me, what's my favorite book? What's my favorite book to write? I think maybe, and it was a real bear to do, but One Was a Soldier, which has a series of framing devices. It opens up in the present day with a group of veterans, or it opens up in, I think, September, with a group of veterans coming to just a sit down, support group. And then we go back in the past, and then we go back to the veterans group, and then we go back to the past. And I really love, as I mentioned earlier, playing with structure. And it has this very complicated back and forth structure with the framing that I just really enjoyed playing with. And was able to sort of do some what I thought were interesting tricks with. So I enjoy, and I also really loved the subject of that. I felt very passionately about writing about returning military members. I come from a military family. My husband was Air Force. My father was Air Force. My son is currently serving in the Navy. So it's something I'm intimately, involved with.
And Chrissy wants to know, when did you know you wanted to be an author?
Ooh, that is always a good question. I am not one of those people that sort of grew up thinking, writing with a crayon, although I do have some early bad short stories written when I was like 14. Usually about a thinly veiled version of myself. And then something terrible happened to her. And then everyone was very sorry they had not been nicer to her. But it was actually, I think when I started to have success as a writer, I got involved with an online science fiction writing group because that was what I grew up reading. My Air Force dad was a member of the Science Fiction Book of the Month Club. So, I grew up with the Golden Age classics. And I did some short stories and character sketches, and I started a novel. I wrote about half of the science fiction novel, and I got this great feedback from other people in my group. And then I took my half a novel to be workshopped at a science fiction writing convention, and professional authors, very respected professional authors, said that my writing was, publishable quality, and my characters were really well-rounded and well-developed, and my ideas about science fiction were out of date and unmarketable because it was all my dad's stuff, it was selling in the 50s and not today. And that was it. I was like, I love this, and people love what I write. And I just got really, really, really excited about that. I think that there is a great benefit if you're interested in writing, in being part of a writer's group, at least early on, because that support and that feedback can be hugely important. And if you discover that if it becomes something that you get hooked on, and first you get hooked on the praise, and then you just get hooked on the writing itself. I mean, don't tell St. Martin's, but I'd still do this even if they didn't pay for my books.
Is there any temptation to go back and kind of revisit writing in the sci-fi world?
Yes, definitely. I think the temptation is there, especially now that science fiction itself is having a big moment back to space opera, which is what I grew up with and what I really, really love. It's become quite...
Very excited by that idea.
Yeah. Well, and I like that. I think what I need to do is get back to writing at least one book per year before I can think about branching out. But that would be fun. It would be.
Cool. Well, I think we are about out of time. So I just want to say thank you again so much for joining us. This was fun. Hopefully we'll get to do this in person in the store next year.
I hope so. And let me just give a plug to the audience out there on behalf of independent bookstores like Murder by the Book. So we're all sitting at home. We're wondering what can we do to support our local businesses. And one great thing you could do is order your books from your local bookstore, from Murder by the Books, from other ones. They're in there, they're packing them up, they're shipping them out. And it's a win-win, right? You get a book that you really want to read, and you are helping keep a super important business going in your community and in communities around the country.
Yeah, we are, Houston just opened up. So if you guys are watching in Houston, they just opened up retail to go. So starting Monday, we'll be back open Monday through Saturdays, 12 to 6. Not open to the public, but open doing contactless curbside pickup. So we've got a table set up outside where you order books, we'll set them out on the table for you. Also, if you guys are around tomorrow was supposed to be Independent Bookstore Day, but it's been postponed to August. But to celebrate, we're going to be doing one of our Murder by the Book Recommends events at 4 o'clock live on Facebook, 4 o'clock Central Time. So you'll be able to get some recommendations from us for stuff too. So Julia, thanks again for joining us. This was so much fun. And McKenna just dropped the link to order Hid From Our Eyes in the comments. So if you haven't gotten your copy, we've got them in stock and we're shipping. And so,
I did bring it to hold it up.
so thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, John.
Take care.